My name is Maya, and I'm 26 years old, a graphic designer in Portland trying to build my career from scratch. I was working late at my cramped studio apartment, surviving on instant coffee and determination, when my phone lit up with a message that would shatter what was left of my world. The text was from my mom. "You're dead to us. Pack your things and never come back or we'll call the police. Don't test us." My hands started shaking. I read it 3 times before the words actually registered. This was my mother, the woman who used to braid my hair and sing me lullabies. Now she was threatening to have me arrested for trying to come home. But before I tell you what happened next and how I discovered the truth that changed everything, let me know where you're watching from and subscribe if you want to hear more. Stories about family betrayal and finding strength when everyone abandons you. Growing up, I was incredibly close to my grandmother Elena. She was my dad's mother, a fierce Italian woman who had immigrated to America as a young bride. While my parents worked long hours at their respective jobs, Nonna Elena was the one who picked me up from school, helped with homework, and taught me how to cook traditional Italian dishes. Her small house was my sanctuary, filled with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of opera playing softly in the background. Nonna had worked as a seamstress her entire life, but she had a natural eye for design and color that she passed down to me. We would spend hours together creating elaborate scrapbooks, designing greeting cards for neighbors, and sketching fashion ideas. She always told me I had a special gift for visual storytelling. "Maya, cara mia," she would say in her heavily accented English. "You see beauty where others see nothing. Never let anyone take that away from you." My parents, David and Karen, were good people, but they lived practical lives. Dad worked as an accountant and Mom was a nurse. They valued stability, steady income, and conventional success. They loved me, but they never really understood my creative side the way Nonna did. When I announced in high school that I wanted to study graphic design, they were supportive but cautious. "Just make sure you have a backup plan," Mom would say. "Art is nice as a hobby, but you need something reliable." Nonna was different. She encouraged my dreams wholeheartedly. When I got accepted to art school, she was the one who secretly helped me with tuition when my parents could only contribute a small amount. She never wanted credit for it, never even told them she was helping. "This is between us, Kara," she would whisper, pressing cash into my hands. "Your education is the most important gift I can give you." During my college years, I would visit Nonna every weekend. We would cook together, and I would show her my latest projects. She kept every piece of work I had ever created in a special box in her bedroom. Sometimes I would find her looking through old sketches I had done as a child, her eyes soft with pride and memory. It was during my junior year that Nonna started getting sick. At first, it was just fatigue and occasional confusion. She would forget appointments or repeat herself in conversation. My parents took her to several doctors, but the diagnosis was devastating: early-onset Alzheimer's disease. She was only 72, relatively young for such a severe form of dementia. The progression was heartbreakingly fast. Within months, she went from being my sharp, witty grandmother to someone who sometimes didn't recognize me. There were good days and bad days, but the bad days became more frequent. My parents struggled with the decision of what to do. They both worked full-time and couldn't provide the round-the-clock care Nonna needed. I volunteered to take a gap year to help care for her, but my parents refused. "You need to finish your education, Maya," Dad said firmly. "Nonna would want that more than anything." They were right, but it broke my heart to see her declining while I was away at school. The solution came from an unexpected source. Gerald Morrison was a successful businessman who had recently moved to our neighborhood. He was in his late 50s, recently divorced, and seemed genuinely interested in helping elderly people in the community. He had started a small home care business and came highly recommended by several families in the area. Gerald was charming and professional. He visited Nonna several times to assess her needs and spoke knowledgeably about Alzheimer's care. He assured my parents that he would personally oversee her treatment. "Mrs. Elena will be like family to us," he promised. "I understand how precious she is to all of you." The arrangement seemed perfect at first. Gerald's team provided excellent care, and Nonna appeared comfortable and well looked after. Gerald would send my parents regular updates and photos, and he always had positive reports about her condition. "She's doing wonderfully," he would tell them. Very peaceful, very content. But something felt wrong to me. During my weekend visits, Nona seemed more sedated than usual. She was always sleepy, always confused, more so than what seemed typical for her stage of disease. When I mentioned this to Gerald, he explained it was normal progression and that the medication was necessary to keep her calm and prevent agitation. My parents trusted Gerald completely. He had become a regular presence in their lives, often staying for dinner after checking on Nona, sharing stories about his business success and his plans for expansion. He was particularly attentive to my mother, complimenting her cooking and asking about her work at the hospital. Looking back now, I can see how he was building their trust, making himself indispensable. The first major red flag came during my senior year. Nona had always been meticulous about her finances. She kept detailed records of every expense and had a modest but carefully managed savings account. When I asked my parents about her financial situation, they seemed uncomfortable. "Gerald is helping us manage her affairs," Mom said. "It's all very complicated, and he's much better with these things than we are." I asked to see Nona's bank statements, but Dad told me Gerald had advised them to consolidate everything for easier management. "It's all being handled properly, Maya," he assured me. "Gerald has power of attorney now, so we don't have to worry about the paperwork." This bothered me immensely. Nona had always been independent with her money, and I couldn't imagine her willingly giving up control to someone she barely knew. But every time I brought up my concerns, my parents would dismiss them. "Gerald has been a godsend," Mom would say. "I don't know what we would have done without him." The situation became more troubling as months passed. Gerald began making suggestions about Nona's care that seemed excessive. He recommended moving her to a specialized facility he owned, claiming her condition required more intensive treatment. The cost was substantial, but he assured my parents it was necessary. "We want what's best for Elena," he would say. "Cost shouldn't be a factor when it comes to family." I graduated college with a degree in graphic design and immediately started looking for work in Portland. I wanted to be closer to Nona, but I also needed to establish my career. The job market was tough, and I ended up taking a low-paying position at a small design firm while freelancing on the side to make ends meet. During this time, my visits with Nona became increasingly difficult. She rarely recognized me now, and when she did, she seemed frightened and confused. She would whisper things that didn't make sense, talking about people taking her things or strange men coming to her room at night. Gerald explained these were typical delusions associated with advanced Alzheimer's, but something about her fear seemed genuine. One day, about 6 months after graduation, I received a call that changed everything. It was from Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly neighbor who had known Nona for decades. She sounded nervous and spoke in hushed tones. "Maya, I need to talk to you about your grandmother. Can you meet me somewhere private?" We met at a small cafe downtown. Mrs. Rodriguez looked around nervously before speaking. "I don't know if I should be telling you this, but I can't sleep at night knowing what I've seen." She went on to explain that she had been watching Gerald's operation with growing suspicion. "There are too many elderly people going into his facilities and not enough coming out, if you know what I mean." She told me about other families in the neighborhood who had entrusted their elderly relatives to Gerald's care, only to find their loved ones' assets mysteriously depleted. "He's very smooth, very convincing," she said. "He gets families to trust him completely, then he systematically drains their resources. I think your grandmother is in serious danger, Maya." Mrs. Rodriguez had been keeping informal records of what she had observed. She had noticed a pattern of elderly clients being heavily medicated, isolated from family members, and having their financial affairs completely taken over by Gerald. I tried talking to other families about it, but he's very good at making people doubt themselves. They all think he's wonderful. This conversation filled me with dread. I immediately tried to visit Nona at Gerald's facility, but I was told she was resting and couldn't have visitors. When I persisted, Gerald himself came to speak with me. His demeanor had changed completely from the charming family friend I remembered. He was cold and dismissive. "Your grandmother is very ill, Maya," he said curtly. "Visits from family members often agitate her. It's better if you stay away for now." I called my parents immediately, but their response shocked me. Gerald knows what's best for Nona, Mom said. If he thinks visits are too stressful for her, we should respect that. You're being paranoid, Maya. It was as if my parents had been completely brainwashed. When I tried to express my concerns about Gerald's financial management, they became defensive and angry. Gerald has been nothing but generous with his time and expertise, Dad said. I can't believe you're questioning his motives after everything he's done for our family. I realized that Gerald had done something very strategic. He had isolated Nona from family members while simultaneously making my parents dependent on him for information about her condition. They were so grateful for his help and so overwhelmed by the complexity of caring for someone with Alzheimer's that they had stopped thinking critically about the situation. Determined to get to the bottom of what was happening, I decided to do my own investigation. I started by researching Gerald's business more thoroughly. What I found was alarming. There were several complaints filed against him with the Better Business Bureau, mostly from families who claimed he had mismanaged their elderly relatives' finances. However, these complaints seemed to disappear from official records after a short time. I also discovered that Gerald had connections with several lawyers and judges in the area, which explained how he was able to navigate the legal system so effectively. He had built a network that allowed him to operate with minimal oversight, and he was very skilled at making his activities appear legitimate on paper. The breakthrough came when I managed to track down Sarah Martinez, a former employee of Gerald's, who had quit his company under suspicious circumstances. She was reluctant to talk at first, but when I explained my situation, she agreed to meet with me. Your grandmother isn't the first person this has happened to, she said grimly. Gerald has perfected a system for exploiting elderly people and their families. Sarah explained how Gerald's operation worked. He would target elderly people with early-stage dementia, offering to help families with care management. Once he gained their trust, he would systematically isolate the elderly person from family members while taking control of their finances. He uses heavy medication to keep them compliant, she explained. Then he drains their accounts systematically, always with legal documentation that makes it look legitimate. The most chilling part of Sarah's account was what happened to people who ran out of money. They tend to deteriorate very quickly once their resources are gone, she said quietly. Gerald claims it's natural disease progression, but I've seen too many patterns to believe that. Armed with this information, I tried once again to convince my parents that Gerald was dangerous. I presented them with the evidence Sarah had given me, the complaints I had found, and the testimonies of other families who had been victimized. But my parents' response was devastating. Instead of being concerned about Nona's safety, they accused me of being jealous and vindictive. You've never liked Gerald because he took over the responsibilities you thought should be yours, Mom said coldly. This is all about your ego, Maya. You can't stand that someone else is taking better care of Nona than you could. Dad was even harsher. You're spreading lies about a man who has dedicated his life to helping our family. This is disgusting behavior, Maya. I'm ashamed of you. The more evidence I presented, the more defensive they became. Gerald had done an excellent job of positioning himself as the victim of my unfounded accusations. He had convinced my parents that my concerns were signs of mental instability brought on by grief over Nona's condition. Things came to a head one evening when I showed up at Gerald's facility demanding to see my grandmother. I had brought a lawyer with me, hoping that legal pressure would force Gerald to allow me access. But when we arrived, Gerald was waiting with his own attorney and a restraining order that prevented me from coming within 500 feet of the facility. Your daughter has been making serious accusations against me, Gerald told my parents, who had been summoned to witness this confrontation. I've tried to be understanding because I know grief can make people irrational, but this has gone too far. For the safety and well-being of all my patients, I can't allow her to continue this harassment. My parents stood by Gerald's side as the restraining order was served. They didn't even look at me. I think you need professional help, Maya, Mom said quietly. This obsession with conspiracy theories isn't healthy. That night, I called them repeatedly, trying to make them understand that they were being manipulated, that Nona was in danger, that Gerald was systematically robbing our family. But they wouldn't listen. Finally, Dad answered the phone and delivered an ultimatum. Stop this behavior immediately, Maya, or you're no longer welcome in this family. We won't tolerate you attacking Gerald anymore. I thought he was bluffing. I thought that surely they would come to their senses once they had time to think about what was really happening. I was wrong. The text message that shattered my world came 3 days later. You're dead to us. Pack your things and never come back or we'll call the police. Don't test us. I stared at those words for hours, trying to comprehend how my own parents could abandon me for trying to protect my grandmother. The woman who had raised me with love and support had just told me I was dead to her. All because I had tried to save Nona from a predator who was systematically destroying her life. For weeks after receiving that message, I lived in a state of shock and grief. I had lost not only my grandmother, but also my parents. I was completely alone in the world, cut off from the only family I had ever known. I threw myself into work, taking on every freelance project I could find, staying busy to avoid thinking about the pain. I tried reaching out to other family members, hoping someone would listen to my concerns about Gerald. But word had already spread that I was having problems and making false accusations. Gerald had been very thorough in controlling the narrative. Even relatives who had known me since childhood began treating me with suspicion and pity. The isolation was devastating. I had always been close to my family, and suddenly finding myself completely cut off from them felt like a death. I went through all the stages of grief, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, while trying to maintain my professional composure and build my career. But I couldn't let go of my concerns about Nona. Even though I was forbidden from seeing her, I continued to monitor the situation from a distance. I hired a private investigator to keep track of Gerald's activities and to document what was happening to Nona's finances. What we discovered was even worse than I had feared. Gerald had completely drained Nona's savings account. Her house, which she had owned outright, had been sold under questionable circumstances with Gerald acting as her power of attorney. The proceeds from the sale had supposedly gone toward her care, but the costs he was charging were astronomical and didn't match the level of service being provided. Most troubling of all, my investigator learned that several elderly people in Gerald's care had died under suspicious circumstances. While their deaths had been attributed to natural causes related to their diseases, the pattern was concerning. In each case, the person had died shortly after their financial resources were exhausted. I took this evidence to the police, but they were reluctant to investigate. Gerald had built strong relationships with local law enforcement, and he presented himself as a legitimate businessman providing essential services to the community. Family disputes over elderly care are very common, the detective told me. Without concrete evidence of criminal activity, there's not much we can do. The attorney I hired was more encouraging. This looks like a systematic pattern of elder abuse, she said after reviewing my evidence. But building a case will be difficult because Gerald is very sophisticated in how he operates. He always has legal documentation for everything he does. We began building a case against Gerald, but it was slow going. We needed more evidence, more witnesses, and most importantly, we needed to find a way to protect Nona before it was too late. But my attorney warned me that the process could take months or even years, and there was no guarantee of success. Meanwhile, my personal life was falling apart. The stress of the situation, combined with the grief of losing my family, was affecting my work performance. I was making mistakes on projects, missing deadlines, and struggling to maintain professional relationships. My supervisor at the design firm called me in for a serious conversation about my reliability. The loneliness was the worst part. I had built my entire life around my family, and suddenly I had no one to share my successes, my struggles, or my fears with. I would find myself reaching for the phone to call my mom, only to remember that she had declared me dead to them. The rejection felt like a physical wound that wouldn't heal. It was during this darkest period that I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar but urgent. Is this Maya Castellano? Elena Castellano's granddaughter. The caller identified herself as Detective Jennifer Walsh with the State Attorney General's office. I need to speak with you about Gerald Morrison and your grandmother's case. My heart started pounding. What's happened? Is Nona okay? I can't discuss details over the phone, Detective Walsh said. But we've been investigating Mr. Morrison for several months now, and your grandmother's situation is part of a larger pattern we've uncovered. Can you come to our office tomorrow? I barely slept that night, alternating between hope and terror about what Detective Walsh might tell me. When I arrived at her office the next morning, I was shocked to find Sarah Martinez, Gerald's former employee, waiting there as well. She looked nervous but determined. I finally decided to come forward officially, she explained. I couldn't live with myself knowing what he was doing to people. Detective Walsh explained that their investigation had been triggered by a whistleblower complaint from someone inside Gerald's organization. We've been building a case against Mr. Morrison for months, she said. We have evidence of systematic financial abuse, medical neglect, and potentially worse. Your investigative work actually helped us fill in some gaps in our case. The scope of Gerald's crimes was staggering. He had victimized dozens of elderly people over several years, stealing millions of dollars in assets while providing substandard care that in some cases hastened their deaths. He had built a sophisticated network of corrupt lawyers, doctors, and officials who helped him operate with impunity. We're preparing to arrest Mr. Morrison and several of his associates, Detective Walsh told me. But we need your help with something important. We need you to testify about what you witnessed and what you tried to tell your parents. Your testimony could be crucial in establishing the pattern of behavior. I agreed without hesitation, but I was terrified about what this meant for my relationship with my parents. They won't believe me, I said. They think I'm mentally unstable. They chose Gerald over their own daughter. I sat beside her hospital bed, holding her hand and talking to her even though she couldn't respond. I'm so sorry, Nana, I whispered. I tried to save you. I tried to make them listen. Part of me hoped she could hear me, that she understood. I had never stopped fighting for her. The doctors explained that her condition had deteriorated far beyond what would be expected from normal Alzheimer's progression. She's been heavily medicated for months, her physician told me. Her body is shutting down from the combination of drugs and neglect. I'm sorry, but there's not much we can do at this point. Nona died 2 weeks later, peacefully in her sleep, but under circumstances that could have been prevented if Gerald had provided proper care. Her death was officially attributed to complications from Alzheimer's disease, but everyone involved in the case knew that Gerald's negligence had hastened her death significantly. I was the only family member present at her funeral. My parents stayed away, still maintaining their loyalty to Gerald despite everything that had been revealed during the trial. I stood alone beside her grave, mourning not only the loss of my beloved grandmother, but also the loss of the parents who had chosen a criminal over their own daughter. Gerald was ultimately convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The judge called his crimes particularly heinous because they targeted vulnerable elderly people and their families during times of crisis. During sentencing, several family members gave victim impact statements, describing how Gerald had destroyed their lives and stolen their loved one's dignity. He was one of those who spoke at the sentencing. I talked about Nona's vibrant life, her dreams for my future, and how Gerald had robbed her of a peaceful death surrounded by family who loved her. I also spoke about the secondary victims, the family members like me who had been isolated and abandoned for trying to protect their elderly relatives. Gerald Morrison didn't just steal money, I told the court. He stole relationships. He turned families against each other. He made people choose between loyalty and truth, and many of them chose loyalty to him over their own children. The damage he did extends far beyond financial fraud. He destroyed families. After the sentencing, I hoped that my parents might finally reach out to me. I thought that seeing Gerald convicted and sentenced might make them realize how wrong they had been. But months passed with no contact. They had moved away from our hometown, apparently too ashamed to face the community where everyone now knew they had been duped by a criminal. Detective Walsh nodded sympathetically. Elder abuse cases are particularly difficult because the perpetrators are often very skilled at manipulation. They don't just victimize their elderly targets, they manipulate family members as well. Your parents were victims too, Maya. Gerald deliberately isolated you from your grandmother while making your parents dependent on him for information and support. The arrest happened 3 days later. I watched the news coverage with a mixture of relief and anxiety, knowing that this would force my parents to confront the truth about Gerald, but unsure of how they would react. The charges against him were serious: elder abuse, financial fraud, medical neglect, and in 3 cases, negligent homicide. I waited for my parents to call, to apologize, to acknowledge that I had been right all along. But the call never came. Instead, I received a message from my attorney telling me that my parents were refusing to cooperate with the investigation. They were still defending Gerald, claiming that the charges were fabricated and that he was being persecuted. The betrayal cut even deeper than the original text message. Even faced with overwhelming evidence, even with official criminal charges, my parents were choosing to believe Gerald's version of events over their own daughters. The detective explained that this was another common pattern in elder abuse cases. Family members often continue to support the abuser even after they're caught, because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting they had been completely deceived. Gerald's trial became a media sensation. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and one by one his victims' families came forward to testify about how he had manipulated and robbed them. But throughout the trial, my parents remained conspicuously absent from the proceedings. They had been subpoenaed to testify, but they pleaded the Fifth Amendment, refusing to answer questions that might incriminate Gerald. The most heartbreaking moment came when I was finally allowed to see Nona for the first time in over a year. She was in the hospital, having been removed from Gerald's facility after investigators found evidence of severe neglect and over-medication. She was barely conscious, her body frail and wasted from months of inadequate care and unnecessary sedation. The civil lawsuits that followed the criminal trial were complex and lengthy. Gerald had hidden assets in multiple accounts, and recovering money for his victims was proving difficult. My attorney was working to reclaim what was left of Nona's estate, but most of her savings were gone forever. More importantly, I was dealing with the psychological aftermath of everything that had happened. The trauma of losing my grandmother, being abandoned by my parents, and fighting alone against a criminal who had destroyed my family had left me with severe anxiety and depression. I started therapy to help process the grief and betrayal. My therapist helped me understand that I was dealing with a form of complicated grief, mourning not just the death of my grandmother, but also the loss of my parents while they were still alive. They made a choice to preserve their own self-image rather than acknowledge they had been deceived, she explained. That choice cost them their relationship with you, and it's a loss they'll have to live with forever. Slowly, I began to rebuild my life. The publicity from Gerald's case had actually helped my career in an unexpected way. Several advocacy organizations approached me about using my design skills to create materials for elder abuse awareness campaigns. My personal experience, combined with my professional abilities, made me uniquely qualified to help communicate the dangers of elder abuse to other families. Working on these projects gave me a sense of purpose and meaning that I had been missing. I was transforming my traumatic experience into something that could help protect other elderly people and their families from predators like Gerald. It didn't bring back Nona or repair my relationship with my parents, but it gave me hope that some good could come from all the pain. A year after Gerald's conviction, I received an unexpected letter in the mail. It was from my mother, written in her familiar handwriting, but somehow different, shakier, more hesitant. My hands trembled as I opened it. "Dear Maya," it began, "I don't know if you'll read this or if you'll throw it away, but I need you to know that your father and I have been going to counseling." The letter went on to explain that they had finally begun to understand how Gerald had manipulated them, how he had systematically isolated them from me while making them dependent on his version of events. "We were so overwhelmed and scared about Nana's condition," she wrote. "Gerald made everything seem manageable when we felt completely lost. We wanted to believe him because the alternative was too frightening to consider." She acknowledged the devastating impact of their choices. "We failed you in the worst possible way, Maya. We abandoned our own daughter when you were trying to protect our family. We know you may never be able to forgive us, and we don't deserve your forgiveness, but we needed you to know that we understand now what we did to you." The letter included their new address and phone number, along with an invitation to consider meeting with them and their counselor if I was ever willing. "We know we can't undo what we did," the letter concluded, "but we love you, and we want to try to make things right if you'll give us a chance." I read that letter dozens of times, cycling through anger, sadness, and cautious hope. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to let my parents live with the consequences of their choices. But another part of me remembered the family we used to be before. Gerald entered our lives before fear and manipulation tore us apart. I decided to write back, not to offer immediate forgiveness, but to open a line of communication. "I received your letter," I wrote. "I appreciate that you're finally acknowledging what happened, but I need you to understand that this will be a long process if we're going to rebuild any kind of relationship. I'm willing to consider meeting with your counselor, but I need time to prepare myself emotionally." The first meeting was held at their therapist's office, a neutral location where we could speak with professional support. My parents looked older, more fragile than I remembered. My mother cried when she saw me, and my father struggled to meet my eyes. "We're so sorry, Maya," Mom said through her tears. "We know sorry isn't enough, but we're so very sorry." The therapist helped guide our conversation, ensuring that we stayed focused on acknowledging what had happened rather than trying to rush toward reconciliation. My parents shared what they had learned about Gerald's manipulation techniques, how he had used their love for Nona and their trust in his expertise to gradually isolate them from me. "We see now that he deliberately made us doubt your concerns," Dad said. "Every time you tried to warn us, he would have an explanation that made your worries seem unreasonable. He was very skilled at making us feel like we had to choose between trusting him and trusting you." I shared my own experience of the past 2 years, the isolation, the grief of losing them while they were still alive, the struggle to rebuild my life alone. I didn't hold back about the pain their abandonment had caused me. "You chose to believe a stranger over your own daughter," I said. "That's something I'm still trying to understand and forgive." The process of rebuilding our relationship was slow and often difficult. There were setbacks, moments when old hurts resurfaced, times when I wondered if it was worth the emotional energy. But gradually, we began to find our way back to each other. My parents were genuinely committed to understanding how they had been manipulated and to making amends for their choices. They had learned about elder abuse and the sophisticated tactics used by predators like Gerald. They understood now that they had been secondary victims of his manipulation, but they also acknowledged that this didn't excuse their treatment of me. "We should have listened to you," Mom said during one of our sessions. "Even if we were confused about Gerald, we should never have abandoned you." One of the turning points in our healing came when they asked if they could visit Nona's grave with me. We stood together at her gravestone for the first time since her funeral, and my father spoke words that I had been waiting to hear for years. "I'm sorry I wasn't here to say goodbye to her properly," he said, "and I'm sorry I wasn't here to support you when you needed me most." My mother placed flowers on Nona's grave, flowers from her own garden like the ones Nona used to grow. "She loved you so much, Maya," she said. "She would have been so proud of how you fought for her, even when we couldn't see the truth." The healing process took time, but slowly we began to rebuild our family relationships. It wasn't the same as it had been before. Too much had happened for us to simply return to the way things were. But it was something new, built on a foundation of honesty and hard-won understanding of how manipulation and fear can destroy even the strongest family bonds. 2 years after Gerald's conviction, I received notification that he was appealing his sentence. The thought of potentially having to relive the trauma of testifying again was frightening, but I was no longer the isolated young woman who had fought this battle alone. I had my parents' support now, and I had built a network of other survivors who understood what I had been through. The appeal was ultimately unsuccessful. Gerald would serve his full sentence, and the civil cases had recovered enough money to provide some compensation to his victims' families. It wasn't justice in the full sense. Nona was still gone, and years of our family's life had been stolen, but it was accountability. Today, I continue to work on elder abuse awareness campaigns, using my design skills to help educate families about the warning signs of exploitation. I speak at conferences and workshops, sharing my story to help others recognize the sophisticated manipulation tactics used by predators who target elderly people and their families. My relationship with my parents continues to evolve. We see each other regularly now, and while there are still moments of tension and sadness about what was lost, we've built something new together. They've become advocates for elder abuse awareness as well, sharing their story about how easily well-intentioned family members can be manipulated by skilled predators. The text message that once seemed like the ultimate betrayal, "You're dead," to us, turned out to be the beginning of a journey toward truth and eventual reconciliation. It forced all of us to confront painful realities about manipulation, family loyalty, and the courage required to stand up for what's right even when everyone else thinks you're wrong. I've learned that families can survive even devastating betrayals if all parties are willing to do the hard work of understanding what went wrong and making genuine efforts to rebuild trust. It's not easy, and it's not always possible. But sometimes the relationships that emerge from such struggles are stronger because they're built on truth rather than comfortable illusions. My grandmother Elena never got to see our family heal, but I believe she would be proud of the work we're all doing now to protect other elderly people from predators like Gerald. Her legacy lives on not just in the memories of her love and support, but in the advocacy work that grew out of our family's tragedy. The message that declared me dead to my family turned out to be wrong. Sometimes the most painful betrayals can become catalysts for truth, healing, and ultimately stronger relationships built on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. But it requires courage, time, and the willingness of all parties to acknowledge their mistakes and work toward something better. Have you ever experienced a situation where family loyalty conflicted with doing what was right? How did you navigate that difficult choice? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, please like and subscribe for more stories about family trauma, healing, and the strength we find in our darkest moments. Remember, sometimes the relationships we lose and then rebuild can become stronger than they ever were before.